Family business makes no sense. So let's talk about it.
Welcome to another episode of Family Business Makes No Sense, where we explore the concept that by putting a family and a business together, you're inevitably going to create conflict at some stage along the line, maybe many stages along the line. So we want to explore why it is that this happens, and more importantly, what do you do about it? Prevention and cure. This is cause number 11, where we're going to be talking about emotional intelligence, or the lack of emotional intelligence, and the effect that that will have on any family in business at some point in time. I'm Jon Kenfield, the Family Business Solutionist, broadcasting from Melbourne in Australia. Over many years and working with many families, it's become very clear to me that the vast majority of family conflicts are not primarily about money. They are about a lack of sense of fairness, they're about relationship issues, they're about personal behavioural issues. They're not primarily about money, although money is often the presenting cause. As a consequence, I have become a solutionist because it seems very clear to me that empathic problem solving, simply problem solving, is going to be far more effective for the vast majority of families in conflict than legal threats, rational arguments, or emotional blackmail. So today we are going to do a deep dive into the concept of emotional intelligence, what it is, and why it is important, what happens if you don't have enough emotional intelligence in your family business mix, and what you can do about it in any of those situations. We talk a lot about emotional intelligence these days, particularly in the workplace, and perhaps also when we're talking about raising children. There's a lot of stuff out there, and some of the classics sit in the Daniel Goleman type work, where the concept of emotional intelligence is broken down to 5 key elements which enable us to get our heads around it and do something about it. In essence, when we're talking about emotional intelligence, we are not talking about problem solving, pattern matching or anything else, although they become significant. We're talking about the ability to recognize and manage our own emotions, to recognize and respond appropriately to the emotions of others, and to build meaningful relationships that have resilience and are constructive rather than destructive. So it's all about really understanding what's going on below the surface at an emotional level in your lizard brain, as opposed to your left-sided, rational, logical accountant's brain, or engineer's brain, or lawyer's brain. Family business is, of course, a unique environment. If you're daft enough or game enough to mix your family in with your business, you are setting yourself up with challenges that you wouldn't normally have to meet if you only had a family as a social unit or you only had a business as a commercial operation. By bringing them together, we add to significant complexity and an enormous danger that we will mix some of the emotional thinking that tends to come from being part of a family with the financial, commercial, rational thinking that needs to keep a business alive. The family business environment mixes both, and behind every family business lies a business family, which also mixes both. So you get family incurring into the business, and you get business incurring into family life. When it works well, it works brilliantly. But more often than not, the challenges prove too difficult to cope with, and the family businesses don't last beyond a couple of generations, if they get that far. So what do we need to know about emotional intelligence? How will it help us to build a stronger, happier family and a stronger, more profitable business? Well, the Goleman concept breaks emotional intelligence into the 5 core competencies that I mentioned previously. And these are sort of abilities that we either have or we don't have. And the proposition is they are abilities that we need to have if we want to have a successful family in business. The first one is self-knowledge. If you know yourself, you know your emotional makeup, you know your behavioural preferences, you know what triggers you emotionally to act or not act or to behave or to relate in certain ways, then that is a very important ability to have. A large number of families that I work with where they have devolved into conflict, one of the obvious observations really quickly is that the matriarch, patriarch, business owner, business leader, and maybe various other family members as well, really don't know themselves that well. They have an idea of who and what they are, but it's not matched by any reality that certainly any external third party would arrive at. And if you ask the question in confidence of people who work with them, live with them, even friends and relatives, they will often paint a very, very different picture to the picture that the business owner has of themselves. And if you have a look at the videos that I will be doing shortly on things like imposter syndrome, founder syndrome, even broken wing syndrome, although that's not quite so relevant, they talk about some of these elements where, for the sake of being able to lead a business, sustain that leadership role, the business leader builds an image of themselves which robes them with strength but may not be remotely close to reality. And that, of course, takes them off down the wrong paths, and it means they are not going to be open to an awful lot of stuff that's going on around them, which means they can't see it, they can't react to it. Which leads us into the second one, which is self-management. If you don't know yourself, and even if you do, if you have poor emotional regulation, it means that you will be at the mercy of your emotions a lot of the time, rather than be subject to your rational thinking. So emotional regulation is something that we try to build into very small children to stop anger. That's why we teach them to play nicely, share their toys, be respectful and so forth, because it helps them to get their base animal instincts, if you like, the ultra-competitive fight for survival instincts, under control in a social environment, which becomes even more important, of course, in a commercial environment. So self-management is the thing that hangs off the back of self-knowledge, because if you know yourself but you don't have the systems and processes to manage, then you can stand outside yourself saying, yep, that's me, as you run amok, which doesn't really help anybody. So self-awareness, self-knowledge, self-management hang together, pretty damn important. The third of the abilities required to be regarded as having good emotional intelligence is the ability to empathise. The ability to put yourself in another person's shoes, and more importantly, walk 10 miles in those shoes. Put yourself in their position, understand where they're coming from, understand how they perceive whatever is going on, and understand why they are responding in the way that they are responding to whatever it is that you and circumstances are doing to them. So empathy is the third ability, and it's something that leaders need to understand if they want to understand what's going on in their workplace. Very common these days for a collaborative workplace where the desire is to have distributed accountability and everybody is a leader in their own space, that sort of thing, which is very different to the militaristic command and control style of leadership and management that we had back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, even 80s to an extent. Now, what I've seen again in workplaces that are highly conflicted is that if you can persuade the leadership team to go through a culture survey, and if you then run the same culture survey through the workplace, you'll discover that the view of the leaders or leader of the culture that they have created may be very, very different to what is reflected back by the people living in that culture, who point out we have these wonderful values plastered all over the walls. We have to recite them at the beginning of every business meeting, strategic planning session, all the rest of it. We have to send them out to all our customers, but we don't live them. The way we work here is a long, long way away from the culture that we declare by stating our vision and our values and our mission. And this often comes as a shock to business leaders who desperately want to have a humanistic, family-like environment, and they achieve nothing of the sort because they are so caught up in the micromanagement and because they just don't understand themselves well enough, and they don't have the empathic skills to get feedback from the workplace about what's really going on. The fourth capability is social skills. This is the ability to create healthy, happy, sustainable relationships with others and sustain those relationships through some forms of adversity. Now, mankind, Homo sapiens, is basically a social animal. It's what's given us dominance over the world, that we are able, as a group, and we developed this in evolutionary sense a great many years ago, we are able to collaborate as far a much bigger group than just about any other type of creature on Earth, with the possible exception of ants, I guess, although even they're in different colonies. So the bringing together of the self-awareness, the self-regulation, the empathy into a framework that enables us to build relationships and be socially competent and socially well regarded is the fourth of the 5 skills. The final one is motivation and resilience, and that's all about inner strength. It's all about, you know who you are, you know why you're there, you're reasonably comfortable in your own skin, you can take setbacks and so on because you know that fundamentally you're striving to do the right thing in more or less the right way, and yes, you could improve, but you know you're on the right track. You don't have the self-doubt of thinking, I'm doing it all wrong, I'm on the wrong track, which creates often a closing down of all the other things you should be doing to be happy about where you're at. So we see people who are enormously successful who are not at peace with who they are, where they are, what they're doing, and despite considerable success, they use a whole raft of powers and authorities at their disposal to create a miserable workplace that is not sustainable over the long term. And they simply can't work out why it is that nothing feels right, when as far as they're concerned, they're trying to do all the right things. That's a difficult revelation to come with, but if it's what's going on, the resolution of their situation is easily achieved. We just need to work on getting there. So I hope it's fairly obvious that when we have a low EQ, low emotional intelligence workplace, which has been largely a result of the culture that had been set by the leadership style and tone of the actual leadership team, because the fish always starts to stink from the head, we are going to have a low trust environment, low collaboration. So low trust means we are inefficient and suspicious. Low collaboration means poor teamwork, which means reduced performance. Low empathy will mean we don't understand what's going on in the workplace until it rises up to bite us or burn us or worse. And if we have a lack of understanding of really what we're trying to achieve, so we've got lots and lots of pretty words, but nobody actually believes that's what we're really doing, then we've got a workplace that is going to be on the edge all the time. Not a great place to be, not the place that people want it to be, and certainly not the place it could be if we develop more emotional intelligence. So, first thing we're going to do is talk about if a conflict breaks out in those situations, what do you do about it? And then finally, we'll wrap up by talking about how do you build these emotional intelligence skills. Now, following on from the theme of what emotional intelligence is all about, in the conflict management space, it's fairly clear that if we try to push through a conflict situation to get rational outcomes by insisting on things like legal rights and obligations, we're probably going to make things worse. If instead of saying we can't change the past, we just have to deal with it so we can move forward, if instead of doing that, we say we have to deconstruct the past to understand how we've arrived at the present from a human perspective, and then we can use that improved understanding to plan for what we need to do to have a better future, then we're in with a much better chance. So tying that back to the emotional intelligence concept, where we've said emotion is what makes you do stuff. Intelligence, rational intelligence, helps you to understand emotion is what makes you do. So if we are going to commence a dispute resolution process, a conflict management adventure, we first of all need to have part one of a conversation. It's a two-part conversation. Part one needs to deal with, and to a degree put to rest, the emotional factors. And if we can take the heat down enough through that process of acknowledging, ventilating, validating, and so forth, we are then in a much better position to start dealing with the rational factors, the real facts of the situation, and in far less danger that whatever progress we make will be sabotaged by the failure to pay attention to the emotional elements at the start. So it's a two-part conversation. Start with the emotional, move on to the rational. And this is where it gets challenging, because you have to move from a sort of psych counselling type hat to a business advisory type hat. So we're deconstructing the problem, and once we've deconstructed it, we spread the entrails out over the table so we can look at all the major components, hold them up to the light. It's a pretty attractive sort of visual. Hold it up to the light and then look at that particular element of the problem from the perspective of that occurred when we were back in the playroom 50 years ago. Now as an adult, if I recognise that that has been the root cause of a lot of problems, relationship problems that have arisen over the last 50 years with a sibling, with a spouse, with a parent, and so forth, then my adult perspective may enable me to deal with that problem, not ignore it, but say, okay, I've now dealt with that, I've now got that monkey off my back, I've now dealt with that trauma, emotional trauma, which has had an impact, even though I haven't realised it, on my behaviours for years and years and years. And when I look at it properly now, I can see that I can have power over it if I choose to have power over it. And I do so choose, it is no longer able to drive me. I've now neutralised that trigger of destructive behaviours. So we basically spread the entrails, we take out the bits. If necessarily, we surgically remove those bits that we do not want to form part of our lives, and we either bin them or lock them in a cupboard or bury them or do whatever you want to do with them. And then we throw all the bits back in that are still healthy. We reconstruct our universe in a healthier form, and that helps us to prepare for the future. That process has now taken us from diseased carcass, just to continue the metaphor, to healthy body, which is basically moving from negative mindset to positive mindset, where we now want to focus on the reasons why we would want to commit to doing things differently to create improvements, rather than be stuck in a basically a cycle of despair where all we could focus on were the negatives. Okay, So that's how we would deal with a developed conflict. That's the thinking to manage stuff on a day-to-day basis. How do we prevent conflict from arising in the first place, or develop better skills to enable us to raise the level of emotional intelligence in our family and in our workplace and in ourselves? And in so doing, we are referring back to the previous video, which was all about mindsets, where Carol Dweck developed the idea of mindsets on the basis if with the right mindset you can increase your intelligence. And that's what we're talking about here. In that particular case, she was talking more about your intellectual intelligence, your capability for doing stuff. Here we're talking about the emotional intelligence, and again, we're saying if we can move from a negative mindset to a positive mindset, we can improve and increase our emotional intelligence. Now, if we go back through the 5 elements that make up emotional intelligence, we'll have a quick talk about how do we increase them. Well, the first one is self-knowledge, and we build self-knowledge by taking the time on a regular basis to simply reflect on how we dealt with a particular situation, how we've gone over the previous day, week, month, year, whatever it is. It's an internal reflection. It's got to be honest, and it's got to be reasonably objective, although you're dealing obviously with a very subjective topic. We should also look for external feedback about how we're doing, and if that feedback comes as a surprise, we've got a problem because we don't know ourselves. If that feedback is more or less in line with what we thought ourselves, then at least we know that we're making fairly realistic assumptions or assessments of what we're doing, how we're getting on. Self-regulation. We need to exercise control. There are lots of simple little things, like if you're in a stress situation, put your hands flat on the table, put your feet flat on the floor. Take 3 deep breaths, take 5 deep breaths, take 10 deep breaths before responding. Draft your answer and sleep on it. Put it under your pillow. Sleep on it before you send it in the morning. So exercising self-control is like developing any skill, will increase your ability to have self-control, internal regulation. And if you have calming exercises that you can use, then you can avoid knee-jerk emotional responses, which may do nobody any good and may not solve any problems. Empathy. Empathy is an interesting one because we can all increase our empathy by working that much harder to understand where other people that we're interacting with are coming from, and working that much harder to make sure that our response to those people is better than it ever has been as a means of addressing their particular needs and interests. So we actively work to empathise with people. Now, in a lot of situations, we'll find ourselves naturally exercising more empathy early on in a conversation that's tense, and slowly as we build trust and rapport, we can reduce the amount of response to where the other person's coming from and assert more of our own needs and control over the situation. But that's an active development of empathy. Social skills. We can work on building our social skills by networking, by having social gatherings, by working with family and friends and workplace, making the extra effort to communicate with people. It's often said that millennials in particular, the younger workforce that we have, craves far more feedback on a much more regular basis, so do it. Use it as a way of empathising and building your social skills. Learn to compliment people, learn to say things that you know they are going to like, that will encourage them, that will help them to become better people. And the final one, motivation and resilience. Find your inner self, understand your inner voice, make sure you're on the right path, and if you need to make adjustments, make adjustments. It's a journey, and the destination is a pretty good thing to get to, but nobody ever really reaches it. Other than that, when think ahead to being on your deathbed, and that old famous saying of, do you have any regrets? And it's often said, nobody says, I wish I'd spent more time in the office, but some people say, I wish I'd spent more time laughing and drinking champagne. I hope you get a laughing and champagne sort of life out of this. And if you found this video useful, if it's just given you one or two thoughts you can work with, thank you. Please give it a like. Please subscribe. And if you know anybody else who could benefit from the sharing of some of these ideas, please pass it on and let them know. Until the next time, Jon Kenfield, the Solutionist, signing off. Thanks for watching.